the pool. Hey Tom, good to see you today, man. I'm glad you had just a couple minutes to come in the studio, talk about some things. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Back to the whole retirement bridge building construction project around the property kind of thing. A lot of change, but it sort of figures in somewhat to today's topic. I'll allude to that later. It's interesting.
Well, I think it is kind of interesting, and I'm glad you had the time to come in. I've was listening to, we talked about this before, but I listen to a lot of podcasts.
Right.
I scan and listen all the time, trying to pick up things. And there's a couple I have subscribed to, and Joe Rogan's one of the biggest ones, 6 million people subscribed in there. So he had Cornel West on yesterday, and said some real interesting things. And what caught me was at the very beginning of how well Dr. West was able to really kind of take from so many different sources to pull together to make a statement about society and how comedy was working, and just the impact of comedy throughout history, but all the way up until now and what's going on. So,
well, he sure brought in a lot of disparate influences. I mean, he was talking about reading, I think, Aristophanes, and in the same breath, we're listening to Curtis Mayfield while we're reading some Chekhov. Also, I don't remember all the allusions, but I really like that kind of flexible mind that can draw from all these different sources, and a lot of folks see them as maybe so different, so almost antithetical, and yet he finds the commonality in these things and pulls them into new direction, really.
That's exactly what I was thinking too, and just the breadth and depth of his knowledge in order to pull together these statements, I thought was fairly amazing.
Harvard, Princeton, he's a top scholar.
That's kind of where he is, and the interesting notion that and I think goes with some of the books he's written is this idea that he puts it in a language where people can understand, the sort of the common man can understand, and not necessarily be something like the intellectual pursuit and the academic pursuit so much as it is kind of communicating with people across these boundaries.
I really like that. I know when I was an undergrad, I had a professor tell me one time that, you're a bright guy and you have a lot of good ideas, but why do you affect this Southern country boy kind of thing? He was talking about me, and at that time that just sort of hurt my feelings, and I thought,
I know, and I'm so sorry. They've never accused me of that. They have, I guess. Forgot about that.
So anyway, the whole idea is you are who you are, and you bring all these things to the table, and it's good. And I think now we live in more of a mashup culture where you bring in all different kinds of music and put them all together, or all kinds of ideas, and it also goes toward that concept we talked about, I think, on our last podcast, where the whole idea of innovation is to orient. That is, look at everything you have, and are there new ways of using it? So I think some of what Dr. West was talking about certainly had that kind of feel to it. It was certainly fun to listen to him and Joe Rogan too. I mean, as they kind of riffed off each other and bounced ideas back and forth.
Yeah, to me, some of the ideas he talked about, how comedy was moved through our society and our culture over many, many years, and the notion that it is a way of communicating, and sometimes it's a way of dealing with our grief and our sorrows and our troubles in a way that is honest and straightforward, so that people can understand it, and the general, the common man sort of can understand that, and it comes from that side of things as opposed to the aristocracy.
Yeah, well, and controversy too, and controversial issues that people really don't want to get at in an open confrontational kind of motif. So in other words, you can say it in humor. So you know the old thing, hey that's an ugly shirt. No, hey, just kidding. Or am I? That kind of thing. So you're really talking about issues that are tough to talk about other ways, but once you put them under the heading of humor, that it seems like no holds barred. You can say virtually anything and address virtually anything, and that's a positive thing in a lot of ways.
I think so. And the idea that it takes courage to do these kinds of things.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, he said this too, that sorry, when he looks at our culture and our society, we don't have a lot of courage. We're sort of going along with things to a certain extent. Now, he said it more eloquently than that, but the idea that to be truly free and to be free to say those things that have that edge to them, like you're talking about, takes a certain amount of courage in going against the grain, and then there are consequences for that as it goes.
Yeah, well, one of the things that both Joe Rogan and Dr. West were talking about, I think, went to this notion of freedom, and when we are truly free, sometimes it's scary, or maybe always it's scary, because suddenly, if you are free, then there is no one to blame for what happens next. We tend to, a lot of times as human beings, I think, maybe look for reasons why things don't go as well as we may have originally planned them. Mm-hmm. And if you're in a situation where the accountability rests with you yourself, which ultimately it does.
Yes.
In most cases. If you're in that situation, then I guess the burden you carry in that is that if things aren't going the way you plan, then do you recalibrate, or B, do you adjust, do you adapt, and that kind of thing.
Right.
At the same time, I think there was a discussion that maybe there's a lack of courage that in the species, I think is the way
right. I think
Dr. West said it, a lack of courage in the species. And I think to some extent, you can see why that would be true. I mean, oftentimes the courageous are the ones who stick their necks out,
go against the grain.
Go against the grain.
Yes, that's right.
But there are several things can happen. It's almost here's I guess a good business analogy.
Okay.
Let's say you're courageous, and so you go out and you borrow a lot of capital to establish a business.
Yeah.
And then the business doesn't go well, and you end up bankrupt, and you lose your home, that kind of thing. Well, I think in a lot of cases, folks would rather not take that risk, because it's easier to go to work for someone, which is what I did most of my life, go to work for someone. Then you have someone, you have rules, you have boundaries, you have these things, and the expectation on your part is that if you follow these rules, stay within these boundaries, you have superiors who you listen to. If you follow all that, then you're going to be okay. And
right.
in fact,
I mean, that's almost the promise of that, and that's a tradition that has kind of passed on, and we bought into it to a certain extent.
Well, I was going to say it's a total mindset, and there's absolutely no reality to it. I mean, it's real in the sense that as long as things are going good for whomever you work for, that maybe things will go well. But just a few things go differently in an organization or in an economy, and suddenly you're just as out to the woods as you would be if you were a business person and you were reporting to yourself. And,
and there's that structure, and I think he used that word as well too, that sometimes we sort of rely upon that structure to get us through, but if the person truly becomes free and says what going against the grain, as we just mentioned, that it's going against that structure as well. So even the ideologies behind those structures, it's going to take that courageous person to make that difference for people, I think.
Yeah, and the payoffs are great. I mean, first that you're being creative, you're working with others to create things, and that you may be taking a risk, but how risky is it? Because any decision is a risk. No decision carries risk. So
right. and that it is a decision. The decision not to do something is a decision.
That's right. So I think getting back to where comedy, what the relationship is, and I didn't see the whole podcast and don't know where these guys went with this, but the whole idea is comedy is sort of a hedge against absurdity anyway. I mean, here's the truth about life, and we don't like to think about it, but we think about it often in common. You're born, you live, things happen that are great, things happen that aren't so great, and then you die. That is that whole existential absurdity.
Ooh, sorry, you reminded me there.
So what is the meaning of all that? Well, it's really hard to get your arms around. The two ways I think humankind has found is certainly one, well, maybe three. Philosophy is one way, and there are all kinds of different ways to approach it. And then there's religion, and then humor. And those are the three things certainly that maybe in my own personal life have given me a lot of comfort, even though I'm aware of what the truth of the human condition ultimately is. So,
and I think that's what he said about structures, that it brings that the difficult, hard to really make sense of, but also just the tragedies that are involved in our life, as you just put a moment ago, as we develop. But then these structures do that same thing too. That there's it's ways of sort of coping with the problems that we all face.
Yeah, tragedies and triumphs. I think of baseball pitchers. I watch a lot of baseball, I like baseball. And I know you were a catcher, so you're this is more your thing than mine.
Short-lived, by the way. Yeah. Left field seemed to be the better spot for me. I think that's what they said anyway.
So successful athletes, pitchers are among those. Are those often who can maintain focus on one thing despite all the things that happen. In other words, if a pitcher had a no-hitter last game, well, this game, that no-hitter really doesn't matter because this game is this game. Right. And if you don't have your best stuff, you don't have your slider, you don't have your curve, or whatever it is you rely on, or your control's off, and we all have bad days, you're going to watch the ball go over the left field fence.
Right.
And then if that happens, then you have a choice to make. And I've watched pitchers play it both ways. Right. I've watched some pitchers who the ball goes over the left field fence, they hear it, they don't even watch it.
Right.
And then they get the ball and they go back.
They're looking at the next hitter. That's right. That's
and
where they go.
There are some who absolutely, that's it. If it's the first inning,
here we go.
Over.
You see it hang their head and the manager's walking out onto the field.
But isn't that a beautiful analogy for life? I mean, you have triumph, you have tragedy, and maybe both of them are ultimately pretenders. But what you're left with is life, and that's sort of absurd when you think about it. So I think human beings are always looking for really setting up a boundary of meaning, and I think it's real hard to make that happen.
I think, it was interesting. He was talking about the arts and music and how stories develop from. I think he's talking about some of those guttural sounds, and it looked like that was a very historical reference where those kind of moans and groans came in to becoming songs, and then as in songs and music, and then that was not necessarily the dialectic. As it became stories that were passed down. Yeah. So these kinds of ways to manage all of that conflict, chaos, if you will, seem to be important for our own human development.
Yeah, and there's the emotional aspect too. So, when you're thinking about stories and songs anything that goes with performance, ultimately, yeah, there's an intellectual component. And we often talk a lot about the intellectual component, and if you can get at the meaning and see what meaning this has. I remember I had a professor who said, how does the poem mean to you when we would read poetry? And I think that's a great question, because what does the poem mean? Well, that's an intellectual exercise.
It's kind of the content too, by the way.
How does it mean? I never knew what he was going for, but I love the question because it made me think, okay, how is that poem different from reading prose? How is it different from listening to a song? That kind of thing. And maybe what he was going for was that combination of the intellectual and emotional that's very hard to get at any other way than we're off on a tangent now, but through art, that kind of thing.
Right.
And I think that's why being an artist always appealed to me. And it's talk about a tragedy. It's a crying shame that I spent most of my career in some kind of administrative role and being so busy that I didn't pursue any of the other things I like to do.
Maybe you can kind of come back to some of that as the artist.
Right.
I was curious too, and he said something in there about the democracy, why democracy is so fragile.
Yeah.
So if I understood it, prior to that, he was talking about these structures of oppression and these sort of the way we structured some of our society, and I guess I'm looking for the difference between the haves and the have-nots to a certain extent, but how society sort of divided us in that way, and that these structures sometimes are a threat to democracy, because democracy is about laughing with others as opposed to laughing at people.
Right.
So fragile democracy, what do you think he was saying in there? What's your take on that?
Democracy, my view of it is it depends on goodwill. In other words, to be engaged in let's think of it as a team. It's a team approach. You and I are involved in this endeavor. We're making podcasts. We're doing various things. For this to happen, there has to be a lot of trust, and I have to ultimately be about good happening for you. I mean, I want it to happen for me, but in any kind of team endeavor, doesn't it have to be a win for everybody? And that the old 70s win-win theory,
Yeah, I think so. And that the idea that he was talking about laughing at someone or laughing down at someone, and,
right?
Quoted in there, but the notion of laughing with somebody together seems like a really way to be compatible and work together and kind of bond in some ways too. So I think that would seem to be a really important message. And the idea of laughing at someone doesn't sound all that great.
Well, laughing with goes toward what's commonality with us. How are we all human together? And laughing at goes toward I think Cornel West would say there's a superior role and an inferior role, and that whoever's doing the laughing is styling themselves the superior. But you talk about
that's a very interesting way to put that, because I think that's kind of that keeps the two separate in that way.
You mentioned the idea of democracies being fragile. Well, any kind of government is ultimately fragile too.
Is true,
when you think about the whole idea of a dictatorial kind of government, or a monarchy where the monarch is absolute, well, those things only go so far until the people decide the monarch doesn't have the power anymore. And a lot of times we forget that the people ultimately have the say and have throughout history. I read, I guess it was Plutarch's Lives, and it's funny how I got to read it. I was reading it because Joseph, my son, had to read it in his philosophy course or government course. I can't remember which. So he's reading.
I think I read the Cherry Orchard Chekhov because my son Colin was in there and reading, and I wanted to find out what was that about.
Well, there it was. The book was sitting there, so I picked it up and I started reading it, and I was but what I was struck by was actually how Roman government worked. And there was a time, and this was for centuries, where an emperor would become established, and through various methods. I mean, all kinds of sort of
somebody's head got cut off or something, but maybe I don't know.
But typically they had the support of the army,
right?
And they go in, and often the rule of an emperor lasted just so long as his subordinate officers, who had originally enticed him to become emperor,
right,
as long as their support lasted. And that was a job that didn't have much of a retirement plan, I will tell you, because the retirement plan was when the subordinate officers and their troops came in and took the emperor out. And so I think about that as, that's short-lived too. Ultimately, democracy, we love, at least in the United States, we give it tons of lip service because democracy is about me, but it's about you too. I mean, ideally. But for it to work, the human condition is such that you're going to have certain points of view, and I'm going to have certain points of view, and a lot of them may be diametrically opposed. But we ultimately still have to have goodwill toward each other. In other words, you can't be the evil empire because you think differently about something. And somewhere we have to find that common direction. And that's what makes democracy hard, I think.
And maybe fragile, as he mentioned too. We have to work for it and keep it going in so many ways.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, I was this and I know I sprung this on you today. First off, but you've done well, my friend, and I appreciate that. But it's just a short clip that has so much meaning to it. I wanted to share that with you and for us to talk a little bit about it, because some of this happens on a podcast and these conversations, and his conversations long form. Maybe 3 hours. I have to go back and look and see how long this was. At least 2 hours on that podcast. You say some profound things, and then you move on to the next topic. And I just like, okay, wait, I have to put a marker there to go back and make sure that I need to explore that just a little bit more. It's sort of like, I don't know, if you're reading a book, maybe going back and reading that chapter again and kind of absorbing it because it has meaning for you.
Yeah.
So I do appreciate that you're stopping by and talking about this clip today.
Well, I certainly could relate, and I think I said Marvin Gaye, but actually it was Curtis Mayfield. Curtis Mayfield. Listen to Curtis Mayfield while you're drinking cognac and reading some of the classic literature. I thought that was just
yes,
that really appealed to me.
That's going to separate you from the guy down at the gas station.
That's right.
Maybe.
That's right. Yeah. And Curtis Mayfield, great guitar player anyway. So yeah.
Well, he goes on to talk a little bit more about jazz, so I encourage you to listen to more of the rest of that interview, that podcast. Tom, thanks for coming by today.
Enjoyed it, Mike. Thank you so much.
The idea that it takes courage to do these kinds of things.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, I mean, he said this too, that sorry, when he looks at our culture and our society, we don't have a lot of courage. We're sort of going along with things to a certain extent. Now, he said it more eloquently than that, but the idea that to be truly free and to be free to say those things that have that edge to them, like you're talking about, takes a certain amount of courage of going against the grain, and then there are consequences for that as it goes.
Yeah, well, one of the things that both Joe Rogan and Dr. West were talking about, I think, went to this notion of freedom. And when we are truly free, sometimes it's scary, or maybe always it's scary, because suddenly, if you are free, then there is no one to blame for what happens next. We tend to a lot of times as human beings, I think, maybe look for reasons why things don't go as well as we may have originally planned them. And if you're in a situation where the accountability rests with you yourself, which ultimately it does.
Yes.
In most cases. If you're in that situation, then I guess the burden you carry in that is that if things aren't going the way you plan, then do you recalibrate, or B, do you adjust, do you adapt, and that kind of thing.
Right.
At the same time, I think there was a discussion that maybe there's a lack of courage that in the species, I think is the way
Right, I think
Dr. West said it, a lack of courage in the species. And I think to some extent, you can see why that would be true. I mean, oftentimes the courageous are the ones who stick their necks out,
Go against the grain.
Go against the grain.
Yes, that's right.
But there are several things can happen. It's almost here's I guess a good business analogy.
Okay.
Let's say you're courageous, and so you go out and you borrow a lot of capital to establish a business.
Yeah.
And then the business doesn't go well, and you end up bankrupt, and you lose your home, that kind of thing. Well, I think in a lot of cases, folks would rather not take that risk, because it's easier to go to work for someone, which is what I did most of my life, go to work for someone. Then you have someone, you have rules, you have boundaries, you have these things, and the expectation on your part is that if you follow these rules, stay within these boundaries, you have superiors who you listen to. If you follow all that, then you're going to be okay. And
right.
in fact,
I mean, that's almost the promise of that, and that's a tradition that has kind of passed on, and we bought into it to a certain extent.
Well, I was going to say it's a total mindset, and there's absolutely no reality to it. I mean, it's real in the sense that as long as things are going good for whomever you work for, that maybe things will go well. But just a few things go differently in an organization or in an economy, and suddenly you're just as out to the woods as you would be if you were a business person and you were reporting to yourself. And,
right, and that structure, and I think he used that word as well too. That sometimes we sort of rely upon that structure to get us through, but if the person truly becomes free and says what going against the grain, as we just mentioned, that it's going against that structure as well. So even the ideologies behind those structures, it's going to take that courageous person to make that difference for people, I think.
arrives before you have a chance to create it. In a way, that is exactly what happens. I think Facebook affords a certain trauma, and there is in that's where there's a sort of a second term here, and it's one that I'm beginning to hear more of, and that is not FOMO but JOMO.
JOMO. Okay, I was just getting the first one down. So
Okay, well,
what is this?
If FOMO is the fear of missing out, JOMO is the joy of missing out.
Oh,
So there is a
okay.
recoil.
Something's been turned here. We're getting
I think we're now beginning to sense that there is. You can see often memes of folks Netflix and chill, for instance.
yes.
These are all an ode to being able to step away from the flow of social media and this interconnectedness, and it's a form of recoil, I think.
So that's an interesting thing that we wanted to be connected. We wanted to be involved. Everybody wants all this information. We want to be on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and those social media platforms. But now that we're there, wait a second. What's happened to make people kind of pull back from this? Because I find that sort of a natural reaction to it.
Well, I've been listening to this guy, he's dead. There's a philosopher named Friedrich Hegel, you know?
Yes.
And he invented Pop-Tarts? No, he didn't.
No, that's
Had
it. The other
nothing to do,
Yeah.
it was nothing to do with Pop-Tarts. But he talks about how that there is a dialectic, and there is a movement, and there's a movement of the spirit of the age, and that each age has its own distinct spirit. And so the zeitgeist, as it were.
Right.
And if our current zeitgeist is sort of defined by this interconnectedness, then we'll see it move, and there'll be this dialectic. There'll be a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis as there's some sort of movement of information, and that the possibility of a mind that could grow. When I think of, there's this concept of digital natives, for instance. Like my
Right.
son is a digital native. Like I can literally tell him stories that, we played outside because we didn't have a computer.
Right.
And he's like, what sort of weird place did you come from? Where's the?
How did that? Wait, you played outside? Oh
like,
yeah.
hey.
See, and the thing about it wasn't the toys you get; it was the boxes. It was those big boxes that you played in back in the day. With the guy,
Yeah,
that
that's
took up
right,
all our
it's
time,
not,
But yeah, so it's re-education. It's bringing back history for.
To
yes,
him,
I'm
it's
trying
like,
to figure it
but
out.
he is a digital native, so the mind that is required for the new age doesn't require a Gutenberg mind, which is what you and I have.
Okay.
We grew up in a land of books. Information was shared. You shared another mind by someone writing something down and handing it to you, or something. Certainly, we had media, we had TV, and all that sort of stuff. But still, it was the zeitgeist was the Gutenberg mind. But now we live in a world of the interconnected, the digital mind. It's a different thing.
Yeah, and it's so fast. Everything happens so fast. So if there's a trauma somewhere, it's everywhere now. So you begin to pick up on it, has an effect on you as an individual. On the other hand, it's sort of good and bad news. We have this ability to connect with people, to build crowds, build audience. If you've got something really positive to say, then more people can hear it, and almost at a moment's notice too. So.
Yeah, I find that I can share nude pictures with people far easier than I could before. I mean, it's just.
Yeah.
It's just not,
Yeah,
it's-
if you haven't learned that lesson, we'll have that on another show
Let's see it,
because somebody needs to kind of control what happens to,
Actually,
with that
whenever
camera.
whenever I send nudes, somebody always replies, "You should see a doctor about that." That's
Right.
really all I ever get. That looks infected. That's really that's all I ever get.
Okay. All right, but so it's having an effect on it. And no, so are you saying the JOMO is pulling back from it? So I want my personal space. Does that mean we cut off the social media? We close the phone down? We go off of social media?
Well, I think if the battle cry of JOMO is Netflix and chill, in some way it may be simply a retreat into another form of media, or it could be a momentary retreat from said thing. I will say that there are all these folks who talk about, you'll see this with some mental health experts, this notion of taking a Facebook vacation. Where
Right.
you literally sort of, unplug. I wonder, though, if the folks who are doing that are those more with a Gutenberg mind.
Right.
If they're, whereas it's interesting because my son, for them, a big form of communication is not books but memes.
All right.
So whether it is Twitter or Snapchat or memes, you convey information in these bite-sized nuggets, usually laced with irony, in his case, irony and sarcasm.
Right.
And there's something interesting about that. Now, how that connects with JOMO, I'm not sure, but it could be a way to those of us who find ourselves lost to Facebook. Maybe there's a natural break that comes with someone in his generation where they literally can save themselves by being pulled into and drowned in envy by just taking nothing serious. Maybe there's a price to pay for that too. I don't know.
Right.
In fact, black and white thinking, which if we're thinking psychoanalytically, why shouldn't we?
Yes.
Is what's called the paranoid schizoid position. And it always is an act of emotional regulation. Whenever we split, as we know folks who struggle with some personality disorders do, splitting is a way of solving the storm inside of us. You are all bad and evil. To be able to speak those words gives a momentary lapse in the turmoil that is you. It offers a clear indication and path for you to follow to steer you away from the things that could be sucking you in. So, black and white thinking always is, and that is not a positive form of hate. And I was sort of thinking about it and I haven't really thought this through, but if we were to, if we wanted, let's say, Nazis or the KKK, if we wanted them to get better at hate, the questions they may ask themselves is, first off, why do I feel this way? Why do I feel that the world isn't fair? And if they were to start there, then coming to an easy solution, well, it's because there are these degenerate people who are different colors, skin color than me, have invaded my country. It could be, wait a minute, maybe there are systemic problems that have kept me from being able to make my potential. That things are rigged in a fashion, or there have been a series of things out of my control that I need to be able to address and understand so that I might be able to advance, as opposed to falling back on this negative hate. They're not drawing a boundary that allows them to self-care. They're simply expelling and projecting into someone else the very things they should own. And that's that trap. They're not good at hate at all.
Okay.
They're lousy at it.
Well, that's a very different way to look at it. So I'm glad you kind of brought that up. And the issue that to me is that and it gets back to a lot of things that we've said in various issues of really that self-awareness and that reflection, and then taking time to pause and really think what's going on and why am I feeling in this way and what's going on, that we don't often do. It's more reactive. And also, I think what we talked about too is projection. It seems like that's just an easy go-to defense mechanisms to hate others. I'm okay on this side, everybody else, no.
And it is remarkably effective. I think I may have used this as an example here before, but I was at one of these leadership things not long ago, and I came into the room, and they assigned you seats. This is at the university.
Right.
And I go and I sit down on my... What now?
They do that a lot at universities, assign seats.
So I'm suddenly, I'm sitting, and I look around and I see everybody around me in their tables. They seem to be talking.
Right.
And no one's talking to me at my table.
Oh.
And so I'm like, you know what? I looked at the table, maybe it's... they sent me with a lame bunch of people. Over there, those are the cool people.
Right, look at how much fun the cool people are, and I'm here with these losers.
They're losers, And that is from a defensive perspective. That is I was experiencing some emotional dysregulation. I had been moved outside of my euthymic window, and the act of projection was a quick and reflexive act of homeostasis. The problem is not me. I don't have to address this.
Right.
They suck. Over there's better.
Okay.
And
there's some relief in that momentarily, at least at some point. Well, yeah. I guess.
And so so I sat there. I think, okay, well, hold on a second. Something's going on here. You're right. Everybody else is talking, and then I realize I have my back turned to my people at my table. my chair is facing this way.
Okay.
And they're carrying on conversation. So I turn my chair to them, and then suddenly we all begin to talk.
Look, there's a group
and I'm like,
here.
they're not actually so bad. And I'm like, wait a minute. But for a brief moment, the solution I came up with, which, short term had a wonderful short term benefit, but it kept me from suffering in a productive way. And I think part of the key to positive hate is there has to be a suffering. There has to be some understanding of what are these intense feelings welling inside of you. And that requires you have to get burnt a little. You have to be able to face that fire to some degree as opposed to simply projecting it into someone else, which is so reflexive and so easy to do. But so that there are well, Zizek's point is that there is a way in which we may think that we've been woke, but that's actually an even greater trap. That to think that you suddenly see things clearly may be to be even further embedded and further trapped in things. So a wonderful example that he uses is that in California they banned straws, and now lots of people are buying metal straws they take with them. They go to restaurants.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
That makes
And so
sense.
this could be an example of being red pilled. For instance, suddenly you realize the straws, and the reason why they banned the straws is because I think the straws were affecting Liza Minnelli somehow. I don't know.
Well, no.
That was
what I was thinking was there's so much plastic that
That's it, okay.
suddenly in the ocean we have this
Okay, now there's-
nation of
there's a lot of plastic
floating
in
there.
Liza
Yeah,
Minnelli.
Absolutely. I'm trying to move through that, but
Okay,
I didn't get
okay,
very
then.
far. Go ahead.
Is she still alive?
Yes.
Okay, Katie. Okay, it's the plastic. So it lasts forever, but the so too much plastic, it's like killing turtles
Right,
and stuff, right?
So they went to paper in California, made it a law, and moved on. Yeah,
Okay, there's nothing wrong with limiting plastic use, carbon footprint, but the problem potentially that is, as opposed to dealing with the root of the problem, of thinking about, wait a minute, what is, why do I live in a world where things are going into the ocean? What are the broader things going on here? You simply affect a small local change that may have no big consequence whatsoever.
Right.
Another example that Zizek gives is if you go to Starbucks and you buy a Frappuccino or a Crappuccino, whatever you buy there, and every time you buy one, you give $1 goes to support a third world country family out of poverty. Okay. And Zizek, so again, nothing wrong with helping, but why would you question? There's a bigger question. Why do we live in a world where there's enough of everything, but there are people starving? So the question would be, you are lulled into thinking you're making a change or a difference, but you're actually just staying asleep enough in the matrix to perpetuate the very thing that has caused all these inequalities.
Okay.
And so
Right.
there is a third pill, or maybe you decide to stay in the matrix and you attempt to be able to understand it from within, maybe even undermine it in a way, or maybe you channel it or direct it in a way that may create larger change. So that's the whole idea behind, and that was the potential third pill for Zizek.
We're just going to kind of recap just a little bit and start
Recap.
back in. I know it's spontaneous and it's in the
It is.
moment. And sometimes it
I
happens.
just crap myself.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about
Shame. What I'm shame.
we're going
See?
to talk about shame today. So
Yeah.
let's talk about that. All right, good to have you in the studio, Dan.
Oh, we're starting from scratch.
Yeah, we're starting from scratch.
I like this. I like
hate to say it, but now that you made me say that again. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Got Therapy and Dan Rose. So, Dan, tell me about what's been going on with you lately.
Well, I'm getting a bit of deja vu here, but you know what? We're not talking about deja vu.
No,
We're talking about, which, by the way, deja vu is a from a psychoanalytic perspective. There are certain defensive and return of the repressed elements that we won't get into, but at some point we will. We're talking about
Okay.
shame. We're talking about its what it is, its role, how it may be chronic and insidious shame may be behind a lot of behaviors that it's hard for us to, that we may not initially be able to point to shame, but it's there, lurking in the background.
I mean, it almost sounds like we had this from birth. I mean, shame is part of the culture, part of what we do in raising children and do some other kind of
and that
things
just sort
as
of,
well,
again, sort of
right?
semi deja vu. I was the example, the mom I was in Panera, and Panera Bread. Can we get any chance of sponsorship from the Panera Breads?
I would love one. They have these things called pecan braids, so I'm all
Pecan
about
braids, yeah,
that.
somebody
but
had
I don't want to.
Well, I was
We'll talk
with
to them later.
I was with one of my colleagues, and she called he called them. Hey, they have claw bears.
Yes.
What she meant was bear claw, but I thought to myself, it sounds French. Claw bear. I'm gonna have a claw bear. Claw
Right.
bear. But she had one way
You're
there.
never going to get an order talking like that. in
Clabert.
Panera, but I'll
But
just
so
go with that.
we're at Panera, and
No,
the
but we're
woman-
going to talk about shame a little bit. And so something happened there. All right. you're gonna
so
get
so
it.
there's a woman sitting next to me, and she turns to her child, an infant, and says, "Oh, I think the boy's diaper needs to be changed." You know,
Okay.
and at this point in this child's development, it is a
Right.
natural process. She simply changed the diapers. But if he had been 5 or 6 years old, that something
Right.
else would have happened.
Not much of a problem at that age, right? But
And
4 or
what may have
5,
happened
yes.
is, and so shame is one of the things that ushers us, that helps get us insinuated into society. So moderate shaming is another example. You pull the cat's tail, and mom or dad says, "Nope, you don't do that. No, we don't pull cat's tails around here."
Right.
At that moment, there is shame is an affect that is central to the potential for the sort of accommodation you need to make to be able to learn. And moderate shaming, then followed by usually containment or modulation by an adult figure. If the
Oh, that's interesting. There's almost
there's two-step process.
yes, it's a two-step. There's a follow-up afterwards that makes sense. I don't think I've ever thought of it in that way.
So think about with that second step, there is a containment of the process, and so you are for a moment brought down, and then you come back up into some sort of if the child gets really upset, then you might say, there, look, it's okay. I just don't want you to pull the cat's tail. The cat will hurt if you do that. I know you love the cat. So there is the pulling of the tail, the response that generates some shame, and then there is another response. That is sort of the moderate shaming that comes from sort of healthy socialization. But lots of folks they either have too much of one or the other, and as a result, it doesn't necessarily become an affect they can make use of.
Right.
And an example, I was thinking of an example where I experienced some shame. I was at my nephew's graduation. He graduated from prison. He's just he served his 10 years.
Where you were going?
No,
with
no,
that,
he graduated from CSU. Can we get
Okay.
can CSU sponsor this? Because we got Panera, CSU.
Doubtful.
That's not gonna happen.
Doubtful. I kind of know some of those folks. No,
That's not gonna happen. Okay.
All right.
But there was a moment, and I was sort of. I don't know if you've ever been to one of these CSU graduations, but they last 12 hours.
Yes, I have. And
there-
yes, they do.
And at some point, I was a little distracted and bored, so I was on my phone.
Okay.
And they would ask you to stand up for certain things, and they ask if you were in the military, please stand up while we we honor you. And I
Right.
stood up because I was just paying attention.
Wait,
and when I
you
stood
up when they
and
asked
so
for the.
so suddenly they're like this, and my wife says, "What are you doing?" And then I realize what's happened, and I feel shame, and then I sat down. Right
Right.
now,
Right. How quickly you sat down. I would love to have the video
I
going
sat
on
down,
that, but still, all right.
But actually, to throw him off, I started talking about my time in Nam. I said how I had to. In
Charlie
fact,
and all this.
I lived off human ears for like 3 weeks. That was like, it's just
this is the story we do not need to follow.
No, if
through
you don't,
on. We'll
I'm just
let
saying,
that go right
you
now.
can chew
but
on an
you
ear
st-
for a week.
Okay, yeah, but you stood up during the time you it was embarrassing in that.
Embarrassing.
Right.
So that moment of shame was a corrective. Now, here's the thing. You probably wouldn't think this, but I've had a relatively healthy development. It's probably not.
Okay, there's no way to document that at this
really
point in
isn't.
time. It's too late. But the behavioral observations.
That there are lots of
may
data
not
that
connect.
would contraindicate this. I
Yes,
realize.
exactly.
But so I was able to sit down. So for a brief moment, and I like this. We talked about this last time. I like this notion of the euthymic window.
Yes.
That's just a fancy term for saying that our nervous system tries to keep things on a kind of smooth balance. And that there is this window where it can go up and still be okay, and down and be okay. And we talked about before that if you're watching a scary movie, it goes up. But it's a scary movie, so you get just scared enough, and then you laugh and you go back down. If you're watching a sad movie, boom, it goes down. So you're watching ever seen this Old Yellers? Ever seen the Old Yeller?
Oh, yes.
I don't want to give away the ending,
Yes.
but they shoot the kid.
Oh, they kid. Wait, what?
No.
There's nothing. No, that's not right
No,
at
no,
all. I don't. You saw a different movie.
I did. That's maybe. But no, they shoot the dog, and so for a brief moment you feel horrible, right? but it's a controlled thing. Shame operates, it generates a parasympathetic response. So it's like suddenly taps the brake on and you go from here to here. Boom. So when I stood up, I went shoom.
Right.
But I was then able to regulate. I was able to laugh and say, darn. I was able to talk to myself in a way and self-soothe myself and say, you know what? That I didn't mean that. I wasn't mean to be disrespectful. It wasn't, all that sort of stuff.
Right.
And I was able to find a balance.
Some people might make an interpretation with it, and ascribe all kinds of meaning to it when really you were on your phone distracted. You heard something.
I meant nothing by it. But you're right. Someone could say to themselves that once again I've screwed up. I always screw up. I should never leave the house. You could feel all sorts. You could do the opposite response. You could say, screw military folks anyway, you could do all sorts. There are ways to answer that.
Either way.
In fact, in the second one I mentioned is a form of that people often don't think about this, but what usually fuels rage, particularly in dudes and in people who have a narcissistic organization, is shame. So when they become dysregulated, they briefly move, just almost, it's like a nanosecond they move down. And then they overcompensate. And they overcompensate through rage because this feeling of helplessness, moving down too much, you feel helpless. Kohut talks about it or Shore talks about it like this too. Shame can generate what's known as an implosion of the self. And think about this notion of implosion.
Serious.
When you are in a shame state, you can feel as if you were completely and utterly bad. The whole world is looking at you, and you are horrible, and you wanna just collapse into this single black point, right?
Right.
It's an implosion, and to avoid that, all sorts of things happen. But if you have a decent developmental history, if you have a combination of nature and nurture at your disposal, then you can self-soothe and you can modulate, right? And so you can come back.
Right.
And we talked about this before, but you might want to think a little bit about the difference between modulation and regulation.
Right.
And the difference is that modulation is usually a bit more sophisticated. I talk to myself. I said, you know what? I didn't mean any harm. This is not about... But regulation could be, what if, right as soon as it happened, I grabbed myself and I just gave myself a huge pinch, right? And that's a form of excoriation. It's a form of self-harm. It's a way of punishing myself and grounding myself in this instantaneous way. So I stop the process, but it's not necessarily a healthy alternative, right? So we want to think about, if you don't have that developmental history, therapy can give you this, the possibility of being able to come up with ways to modulate. Maybe you begin with regulation. And when we think about this and when we're working with patients, we often give them regulatory homework or tips. Look, it's been a bad day. Go sit in the hot tub. It's been rough. Why don't you go watch a movie? Nothing wrong with those, but they are regulatory. To modulate requires some owning, awareness, and integration. You have to have a dance with your emotion. So it requires a combination of mindfulness of your own states and then a mentalization of yourself and the world in such a way that you could do something with it. Right. Does that make sense?
No, it absolutely makes sense. And if you can't find those things, if you're not in therapy, you have a therapist who's helping you out with some of those ideas, you may be left up to your own ideas yourself, and
that's where that regulation, and that's where that regulatory function or complete dissolution. We with folks who struggle with personality disorders, folks who borderline personality disorder, for instance, they can experience that implosion to such a degree that they want to die, or that they hurt themselves, or they simply fall to pieces, right? So there is this. But what I think makes shame so insidious is that, and since I've been thinking about this concept, I've been sort of listening for what happens with me.
Okay.
And I can think of numerous occasions if I'm in a staff meeting or if I'm in a meeting or something, and I'm in a room full of people. I'm aware that I am susceptible to shame in all sorts of ways. Like if somebody begins to talk and I hear that they're articulate in what they're saying, and I say to myself, wow. Man, they really talk good. I don't talk good. And then suddenly I can feel the potential for some shame.
Right.
And if I'm not careful, I will regulate by starting to doodle or check out of the meeting.
Okay.
I could dysregulate. Actually,
Right.
this is more a
Some
form
ways.
of regulation. Is I could say, they're idiots. They don't know anything, right? Then that's a narcissistic way to be able to diminish them as a way to create some sort of equilibrium myself.
Sounds like there's so many different ways to respond in that. Then some are much better than others. But if you go down the narcissistic route, maybe the others, we start to blame other people or point fingers out.
And that's the essence of sort of that narcissism. But remember that if there were three ways to do this, if there is dysregulation where I simply fall apart and I stew. If there is regulation, both positive and negative, doodling is positive in a way, but it keeps me out of the meeting. Narcissistic projection, that generates a different, maybe negative. But a third will be modulation, and that's to be able to notice the feeling that I'm having, to generate some curiosity about it. And that's where that self-reflective mindfulness kind of sort of comes in. What is this thing I feel? Why do I feel it? Once I give that a name, then I can do something with it. And then I can say, there I go again. Sometimes I can really feel bad in ways that may have nothing to do with the world I'm in. And then I might be able to lean first into myself, give myself credit, be kind to myself. Okay, this is part of what I struggle with, who I am. And then I can lean into them and say, you know what, they're okay. They really did their homework. I can tell they prepared for this meeting, maybe in ways that I didn't, and I sure am glad they did. So there are three potential, and I think I said this last time, we can think of there are three yeses that make the third at least possible. With the simple implosion, none of those yeses happen. With the regulation, at least one or two. And the first yes is you have to be able to become aware.
Right.
You have to acknowledge. And the second yes is to say yes and to be able to own it. Yes, this is me. Yes, this is happening to me. Yes, this is me. And the second is, yes, I can learn from this. And that's where the modulation comes in. It allows you to sort of think about it in a way that there could be wisdom. And we talked about this last time too, that if part of our job, not as just as therapists, but also as human beings, there is no way to get rid of suffering, but we can find a way to get better at suffering. And in those moments of suffering, there's the potential wisdom. There's something that could arrive in a way that could grow us and the world that we're in, and that'd be cool if we could do it. So,
Yeah.
I feel really bad because I talked a lot and I didn't say anything stupid. So I've got a lot of stupid things built up. I'm just going to tell
Well,
you.
let's just let's don't go down that road of shame. Let's practice some modulation there, if you will.
That's right.
I'm fine with that, as a matter of fact. So I think you said a lot of good things there. It does seem like, and you mentioned complexity. It does seem like this is a complex psychological transaction that you're having inside. I'm not sure. Do many people have that, or maybe this is part of a bigger issue?
You have to be an
in a way.
obsessive bastard like me. That's really where it comes in.
I'm not going with that. It's almost as if we have to prepare ourselves for dealing with shame. We know these things happen, but you have talked many times on this show and about the idea, the need to really take the breath, to lean in, to think about things, to become self-aware,
to become curious in a way.
Well, yeah, it is something like that, and I just, we all need to get trained up on this.
Well,
It's not an easy reactive.
I
kind
got a
of thing.
mortgage to pay, so I'd love for everybody to want to get really into this sort of thing because it would, I could pay off that mortgage. There's some.
Okay, so you're looking for a profit in this.
I am.
I understand
some
that,
plastic surgery I want to do. I want to get those butt implants. And
Oh, please, no, not that. Not that.
I was only able to afford one. That's why I'm sitting funny. 'Cause
All right, you're sitting at an angle. All right, wait. Let me ask another question. This idea of shame, you've been sort of centered on the self with this, but people use shame on others. You talked about the parent doing that, but then sort of pulling back a little bit and having the second part of that where you can contain it a little bit. But it seems like shame is being used as a weapon almost in our society at different times.
Yeah, and if we could think about that, there is a way in which all these emotions have a place. And shame may be the most difficult to find any sort of thing useful with it, but it has a place. But I think it becomes weaponized when the person doing the shaming is in a narcissistically vulnerable state, and so they shame. And we as parents can do that. Like, as a psychologist, I'm obviously a perfect parent, and don't ever do this. That was a horrible joke, because the first thing that...
As soon as you mentioned that, it was, I think most people hearing this would
Well, it's
understand
fascinating because I had a child later in life. I was 72. And kidding, that was my IQ at the time.
Oh, you beat me to that joke, but it was I couldn't quite get there in head.
So I was 40 when I had a kid.
Okay.
And so I'd work with adolescents especially, but I would work with some kids, and I would do family therapy now and again. And we're taught in textbooks all this thing about how to be a parent, and
Sure.
we often have this image. I see this often when I'm training younger therapists that parents shouldn't do that, and they'll often side with patients in terms of sort of vilifying parents. Not that sometimes parents don't, but when I had a child, it became so apparent to me how difficult this was, and that there is no way to do this perfect, and the best you can hope for is okay and good. And I say this because children are a challenge, and they touch our buttons, and they take us out of that euthymic window in so many ways. And I can think of sometimes when I'm in a place where I'm angry at my son, or I want to shame him, if I can slow myself down, just like I would be in one of those meetings, if it's possible to be, right now there is something my son is doing or saying that is making me want to really just jump down his throat. What is it? If I can catch it, then I don't necessarily weaponize shame. That can be sometimes tough to do. Sometimes it has to be retroactive. Like, I remember my son really likes video games.
Okay.
And I remember he saying to me, he was proud, "I'm a gamer," he says. Now, he feels pride in that, but, video games make me nervous. And I was hoping he would say that he's really into postmodern poetry. And he didn't say that.
No.
He was
that's a long shot, maybe, these days, but yes.
He wasn't going to tell me how much he likes John Ashbery. If he said that, I'd be like, man, you're my dude. But he said that, so my first response was to denigrate. I could really feel myself, and then I stopped and think, but, my son is growing a dad just like I'm growing a son, and he has given me something that I need to find a way to accommodate. I've never been the dad of a 12-year-old, and he's never been a 12-year-old. So we're working on this together. And so, once again, if you're able to take note of this, to be curious of the emotion that you have, at least if not in that moment, later, and then you can lean first into yourself. And the image is like when you're on an airplane and the thing comes down, you're supposed to take a breath first, and then you lean into him, and then I'm able to meet him where he's at and to say something like, "I really, really love the fact that you can tell me the things that you love. This is how you make a good life, to find the things that you love and to pursue them, and that is wonderful. Don't ever lose that, son." And that is a different route to go than throwing his computer out the window and making him wear a football helmet for, the next 3 months.
That's not what you do.
Or at least make him read John Ashbery. I was going to quote some Ashbery, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. But in a second, I will. Don't worry. A little bit of like a blip there. Then something happened.
There was a blip, and
do you know what it was? It was. I think it was a quantum singularity. That for a brief minute, everything ceased to exist.
Is that Ray Kurzweil? Is that are we at the singularity? I thought we had a ways to go before.
I don't know. I got.
All right, but
I'm told anytime I'm naked, that's when it's there. That's really singular.
Good thing we don't have to see any of that too.
Actually, I got
so
pictures.
we're talking about shame. And
Shame. Speaking of, nudity and shame they're really highly connected.
I'm going want to try to get this conversation going back to where we are, and we could go in there. I'm not sure.
Well,
that
where were we
you
at?
would go where
Bring
I
me back.
was.
Where were we at? What was going on?
All right, so this idea of others shame, you being used in culture and that kind of thing, I think is where we're talking about. So, but you were talking about this modulation of shame, being able to sort of maintain it, first being aware of it, and then kind of coming
Those
to
three yeses.
some kind of way.
That awareness, that's not a. It's awareness, an owning, and then being able to learn from it. And maybe the way to think about this is that shame is one of those emotions that we're really pushed away from. It's not something people want to lean into. It's not something people want to think about. Like, we take the example I gave of standing up at the graduation when they were honoring the veterans. There's even something to learn there, to be able to say, well, why was I on my phone? Is there something about the way that I handle my stress that may keep me out of situations? If I had been more awake and alive, there may have been things that I could have experienced that I missed because I wasn't there. Right. And the shame may allow me to think about that. All of our emotions are supposed to give us a snapshot into the world that we're in and the world that we could build. They tell us things about the now and also the future, what we could be accomplishing, where we could move. And so what I might say to folks who maybe, whoever might be listening to this, most of those are going to be folks in prison. Death row, I think, is the number one. That's
how demographic is.
I think it's death row. Death row.
Hope you guys are doing well.
It is. That's right.
Yeah, shout out.
All I got to say is make sure that you do spell check before you do your homemade tattoos, because that can be embarrassing.
Yes,
I'm telling you.
Yes.
Great
commercial, no regrets. Okay.
Yeah. If you put Santa instead of Satan, it really sends a different message. I'm just saying. It's just not as tough. But walk away, I think, from this. Something sort of a takeaway to think about this is like all of our emotions, shame can be something we can listen to. And if we can grow from it. And what makes shame insidious and chronic is it's one of those feelings that we often don't look into. It's usually masked by something else. Sadness, that's one. But more often, I think, anger. And I think we are often moved, and again, think about that euthymic window. If you can imagine just that, we briefly get pulled here, and it's much better to be an explosion than an implosion. It's much better to be able to affect the world than to be broadly affected by it. And so we move to here. And the goal, I think, to think about is how can we listen to this and try to own it? And one of the ways to do this is we were sort of joking earlier about therapy, and again, I still got that mortgage. But you could just practice being aware. You could just try to give yourself a moment or two to practice being aware and connected with the things that move through you, the feelings you have. That's the beginning of opening up that first yes. Right. And you can practice that. You can sit with the things that you feel. You can just listen for what moves inside of you. That's the first step, and that's something maybe to sort of think about.
Yeah, I know we talked a lot about these kinds of issues where people have to really begin to reflect on their own experiences and be in touch with that, not be afraid of it. And I'm thinking that's kind of the crux of the matter, is really to be able to sort of step back from what happened and what you're feeling, and I'm not sure. I mean, if we could bottle that and sell it, I'm not sure everybody's doing that, because the response to shame may be this narcissistic, or maybe anger, as you talked about a moment ago. So I'm kind of curious about that. It's almost like that's the first step that has to happen before anything else happens.
And that's where the practicing begins. What often happens if you're in a therapy setting, you're in a safe situation where you can spew and you can simply feel, and the person sitting across from you might be able to help you to start name it. And in the naming it, you become aware. There's another saying by one of my favorite cats, Wilfred Beyond, it takes two people to think a dangerous thought. Shame is such a dangerous thought, often being in the presence of someone else. And this is something that you internalize. So when you have the capacity for regulation or modulation, when you have the capacity for at least those first two yeses, it's because you had someone in your life who did that second step we talked about. You weren't just shamed, but someone who also helped to hold you afterwards so you could do something with it.
Right.
The therapist becomes that. It's sort of a corrective emotional experience. You begin to have, it's a little bit in a way of form of reparenting. And then you begin to internalize that. And you can do that a little for yourself if you begin to practice too, how to be able to listen to those moments when you can feel it arise in you.
Right. And this idea of shame almost so sounds like it's a hurtful emotion, a hurtful event. It hurts you at a deep level, and it can trigger other things. I mean, if you're a little on the depressed side, it can make you probably more depressed.
Right. That's that sadness piece, right?
Yeah. This is an interesting topic, though. I'm not sure that people talk a lot. We try to avoid shame. I don't want to be shamed, or I'm put up a big defense.
It's nobody's
against those
favorite
kind of
dwarf. People like Dopey, they like Doc, but they don't like shame.
Is that one of them? I don't know.
I don't know.
that didn't sound like
I don't know.
that's a
Another
real
thing
thing
there's
for a second, but
Dopey, there's Dopey, Doc, Moist. I can't think of some of the other names.
yeah.
Incontinent.
All right, I got one joke for you about that. Yeah, well, all right. So the dinosaurs, the reindeers they hate the most. The name of the reindeer that the dinosaurs hate the most.
Well, what is the name of the reindeer that dinosaurs hate the most? I don't know. What would that be? Comet.
Comet. You got it.
I thought about that. I
All
was
right,
like,
he gave you a,
which, by the way, if you're into music, the
Yes.
band Wire have a great song called Comet.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we need to do a music show
Let's
with
do
you.
it.
That's a problem, though.
well-
You're obscure.
I was telling you, on the way in here, I was
so
feeling the weight of my week. I was feeling wearied. It wasn't shame I was feeling exhaustion. I was feeling spent. And then someone mentioned that there's a new John Luther Adams composition that they have a recording of, Become Desert. And suddenly I felt myself more alive.
Hey,
When
there's something new. we're
I am
looking
going to
forward
find that
there.
thing
There
when
we
I
go.
get home, and I'm going to listen to that sucker. And then
Yeah.
my wife's going to kick me out of the house.
Yeah, and she's going to say, "Take your records and get the heck out of
Yeah.
here." All right. So, well, that's kind of fun. All right. So we did this this last time we met, and we talked a little bit about self-help, and there's a lot of other things that we're going to do through the studio here.
Dating
that.
dating tips.
No, it's not a dating app at all. Here's the thing. What advice can you sort of encapsulate here for people around this shame? I mean, first, shaming others is not probably a very productive way to go about changing another's behavior. But what can you do about your own shame? So, self-help minute, what would you say?
Well, again, the capacity to be able to insert a pause between the reflexive behavior you engage in. So if you can think before you act and feel before you act, that's really important. That's the beginning of a yes. To develop a curiosity for the things that move inside you, including things that don't feel so good like shame. And I know that takes practice. But the first step is to be curious. What is this that moves in me? There's a theorist by the name of Jacques Lacan, not Shaka Khan, very different person, who talks about that there is an extimate core inside us. And think about that. It's a fancy, really weird word that there, as opposed to something intimate, it's something inside of us that feels like it's not us. So it's extimate. And shame is one of those extimate, not me states. And so there are many things about us that are us that we haven't had a chance to dance with. We haven't had a chance to be able to bring them up and give them a seat at the table. So the beginning of this, if you can, is really curiosity. So what I might ask is, it's very easy to feel, when we feel shame, we want to disown something we're experiencing. We want to remove ourselves from the situation. And I know this is not something that can happen overnight. But if you can begin to develop the curiosity and to listen for And that requires being kind to yourself in lots of ways, allowing yourself to be foolish and an idiot. These are all steps in this process. But again, I go back to curiosity. How can you begin to just listen and think about yourself in some ways that maybe you don't often allow yourself to feel and think?
Yeah. Oh, well, that's good advice. This idea of sort of being a little bit more aware of things and not being swept away by your emotion. I mean, we've talked about this as well, as you don't really have control of those emotions that pop up, and we tend sometimes to sort of stay in that state, whatever. If it's a negative emotional state, we may stay there.
And you think like oftentimes, like I can think of things that may be shame triggers for me. And anybody who begins to make fun of my Tiny Tim memorabilia.
Yes.
And I think,
I apologize for bringing that up almost every time we meet.
That's right. But it's not a big deal. That's also something to think about. All of us have specific triggers. There are moments where we have been shamed in the past. There are moments where nobody gets through. Comes out of the womb and stays on the planet for very long before they have a few wounds from the shame that they've had. And that may be a question to ask yourself too. What are the triggers? What are the things that often bring you shame? What is it that about who you are or where you've been or where you're going that might make you ashamed?
Well, now, final question. Is there anything positive about shame? Well, is there a positive aspect of shaming? I mean, it certainly parents use this all the time.
Moderate shaming is part of socialization and whatnot. I think like any emotion, the most positive thing about it is, and I've said this before, we have no control over what we feel, and it's supposed to be that way. If we had control over what we feel, we would choose happiness, and we would have all been eaten by bears long ago. They would have found us easy pickings. We would have been sitting in a corner, rocking back and forth, smiling, and they would have just gobbled us up.
Right.
So the positive thing about it is our emotions are important. Give yourself both credit and cut yourself enough slack to be able to be okay with, to some degree, with what you feel. So the takeaway is shame is positive, just like all emotions are positive. The act of shaming someone may not be, because that may be a moment when you're not being curious. You are discharging and projecting. You are taking something you feel and you're trying to place it in someone else. But the shame that you feel and the emotions you feel, they are positive because they point you toward who you really are and and may help you go where you may want to go.
All right. I like it a lot. All right. We've learned a lot about shame today.
Yeah.
We had there's no shame in doing...
No, or Tiny Tim. Nothing about Tiny Tim that you should be ashamed of. His version of Tiptoe to the Tulips. I don't know if you've...
Do you have that album? First of all,
albums. I got albums. I've got more Tiny Tim bootlegs than you, that guy.
Bootleg. Oh,
guy
man, this is too much. All right, so we talked about shame today. All right, so...